LBR LBO Debrief Business Climate Outlook of 2016.
Based on the presentation, as well as what previously Ralph showed us a very interesting slide, what are the economies important for us on different dimensions, the question I think we need to ask ourselves, having listened to Gulati, have we excluded strategically ourselves from the intra-Asia trade? Because according to the Ralph's, slide, where was Asia? We are still very closely integrated link to economies which are quite far away geographically. While the intra-Asia is rising, growing, and strengthening, are we doing enough to ensure that we have a significant part of our business plugged into the Asian economies? The next question is India. If India is the fastest growing large economy in the world, we are just sitting half an hour, 1 hour away from India, and what are we doing about it? So there are some interesting things to think about. I also would like you to start sending in your questions either on Twitter, Facebook, or using your mobile phone text. Please send out your questions and your comments. And I also see some of you are using Twitter and Instagram and posting various comments, and kindly use the hashtag which is given at the back of the paper. The hashtag is #LBR LBO Debrief when you're making social media comments. Thank you so much. Now it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Paulius Kuncinas, Managing Editor, Asia Oxford Group, as to tell us about the shifting geopolitical landscape and implications. Last evening, I was talking to Dilshan Rodrigo about our today's discussion, and Dilshan was talking about, hey, we look at ISIS as entertainment providers because ISIS is happening somewhere else. I think the challenge is, we need to look at ISIS and the Middle East crisis beyond the entertainment and the primetime television entertainment value they provide, because in the closely integrated world, we cannot exclude ourselves, we cannot isolate ourselves from the regional conflicts that are taking place. So it is a challenge how to make sense and also get a feel, how these conflicts and how this emerging new geopolitical global order is affecting our business and our economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paulius Kuncinas. Thank you.
LBR LBO Debrief Business Climate Outlook of 2016.
Hi, good morning everybody. Very good to see you, so many of you here. And I'm glad to see that there's refreshment on the table, because I was going to say I'm your last speaker between refreshments and myself. As you heard, my name is Paulius Kuncinas. I am the Managing Editor for Asia at Oxford Business Group. We are an international research and publishing house with a sharp focus on emerging markets. For the last 20 years, we've been covering smaller emerging markets, the so-called non-BRICS, especially the Middle East, Africa, of course here in Asia, and of course Central Asia, and now increasingly Latin America. And indeed, it's a very big honor for me to be talking to you today on a subject that I don't normally cover, but certainly very much on all of our minds is the big word geopolitics. The word that's, I think, summarizes the sort of the overall, what Henry Kissinger likes to call the global order and the forces that move it. So today I just will try to give you a very quick journey, a 360 perspective on the key conflicts, flashpoints, and how they relate to trade, FDI, and investment. So I'm located in Southeast Asia. I live in Kuala Lumpur. So my perspective is definitely slightly biased in that I look at the world more through the trade perspective, through the trade lens and investment lens. And I have to say that 2015 has been a year of real uncertainty. I think the geopolitics has been in a flux. And partly this is some long-term structural challenges, and of course a number of very new challenges that we have witnessed this year. So for full disclosure, I subscribe to the school of thought that says that one of the main problems with geopolitics in general is that we lack a willing superpower to regulate foreign relations. Translated into other words, put it more simple, I think there is a lack of leadership from the United States in the foreign arena. And I believe that the nature of the US politics dictates that foreign policy tends to be short-termist. And there's lack of long-term commitment, which has created a certain vacuum, especially lately we have seen in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Asia. So 2016 flashpoints, let me just go through them. I think undoubtedly one big surprise has been re-emergence of Russia as a real foreign policy player, as a very assertive actor that is basically challenging the multilateral order, that's challenging the notion of sovereignties, and is pushing, is really testing the unity of the European and US policy approach. I think you've all followed the Ukrainian conflict. This perhaps is not vastly relevant to Asia in direct trade terms, but it has really let the genie out of the bottle. No longer is Russia willing to sit back and be a passive player. Russia has certainly pushed its regional interests to the very, very limit by waging a proxy war in Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine, by annexing Crimea. It has certainly created a lot of tension in Europe, especially the eastern part of Europe. It has it has raised a lot of questions about the role of NATO and the ability of NATO to actually contain Russia. And it has resulted in direct trade sanctions. So this is, a very direct link to trade and investment, because, as you well know, Europe, led by countries like Germany, has taken rather hard stance towards Russia. And even today, we have sanctions in place where majority of European exporting nations, such as Germany, France, Italy, have had to redirect their exports elsewhere. And of course, the number one focus has been on finding new customers, new demand in Asia. So that's a direct consequence of the events in Russia and Ukraine. And closer to Asia, we have seen escalation over the South China Sea dispute, especially the Spratly Islands. We have seen rather aggressive, assertive policy from both China and, of course, even the United States has stepped in. China, as you know, has been constructing physical infrastructure around the Spratlys, claiming their space, and US has responded by sending in naval ships which have challenged and tested the international rights on the international waters. And of course, the U.S. ally in this particular dispute, the Philippines and Vietnam, have been very vocal and concerned about this escalation. And I believe it is going to be diffused. I don't think it's going to be escalate any further, but has certainly heightened the geopolitical tensions in Asia and in Southeast Asia, and has raised a lot of questions about the response that we can expect from especially the ASEAN bloc. And now, of course, the biggest ongoing flashpoint, the conflict, is the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS, the ISIL. We've just seen some pretty horrific attacks in Paris, which has brought this conflict back into sharp focus and has dominated the headlines and the recent meetings of G20 in Turkey, and of course Obama's visits recently to Asia have been all dominated by ongoing discussion and the search of response. My wider point about what's going on in Syria, Ukraine, and even Russia is that overall I believe we're drifting towards what I call a state of frozen conflicts. Even Syria has, until recently, has been a neglected conflict. It has lacked any serious strategic approach from either Europe or the United States. And what we're looking now is sort of, again, for quick fixes, quick responses. There is, unfortunately, I don't see any overall strategy in how to resolve this particular conflict politically and put it on a more long-lasting path. And finally, I think the one to watch, and perhaps less talked about, is the growing tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And there are many different issues here at stake. Of course, the traditional historical regional rivalry, the peace deal with Iran has certainly given it a new lease of life in terms of economy, in terms of trade, in terms of oil exports. And of course, the ongoing Syrian conflict is very much part of that ongoing rivalry. And things, unfortunately, has deteriorated significantly. One conflict that we haven't really looked much deeply at is Yemen, which is still ongoing, and very much display of Saudi military influence against the Iranian interests. So these are that's how I would frame the world from where I sit, from where we sit, and these are the top concerns in 2015 that I'm afraid will continue to be extremely relevant in 2016. So now just switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about how is this all impacting the trade, the investment, and what is the economic policy doing at the back in the background of all this. So clearly, we're in a world where there's no longer one school of thought in terms of how to do economic policy. And that's already started with the subprime debt crisis, when the US has shown to be a weak economy and certainly not a role model. It continued throughout the different responses to the crisis. Namely, in Europe, we had austerity. then a backlash against austerity. We nearly lost Greece, and we nearly saw the collapse of the Eurozone. So I think the world is definitely in search of answers. It's still, there's no definite model that fits global order. We are in a sort of still the globalization stage. I think, broadly speaking, countries, political elites are committed to trade. There's a huge premium on continuing the trade flows, making sure, I think on the positive side, the political elites have resisted any temptation to introduce capital controls or start what we call competitive devaluation of currencies. There's been a little bit of that, for sure. I would argue that Japan and Korea were allowed to devalue. Some are concerned that China is beginning to play with its currency. But by and large, I think the world has avoided this particular risk. But on the other hand, I think there is lack of visible direction. I think there is, in Asia, there's definitely a rise of a form of economic nationalism. Especially we see it in Southeast Asia, in countries like Indonesia, in all of the countries that have high growth, for instance, the Philippines. The political elites are very precious about their own domestic demand. And they're aware that there's not much growth outside of Asia. Europe and United States are flat in terms of growth. And therefore, there's a temptation to give your local companies a preference. And that has resulted in a lot of hidden barriers. Whereas if you look at the trade tariffs and normal trade barriers, they have come down a lot and now considered to be around 5% of cost of sales. But the hidden barriers, the compliance issues, have really skyrocketed. And now, in at least in Southeast Asia, where I follow this issue closely, the cost of moving goods in terms of compliance has gone up to nearly 30% of sales. So that is the real battle, is the issue of compliance, regulatory harmonization, and hidden barriers has become a big issue of late. And of course, the really exciting part of the Asia story is the emergence of new markets. Of course, Sri Lanka is one of them. It's considered to be a new frontier market, very exciting in terms of its profile, in terms of its growth dynamics. We also have Myanmar, one of the newest big markets in Asia. And arguably, Vietnam is having a second cycle. It's it's gone through a crisis, it's been there before, but now Vietnam is really on the way up. It signed an EU FTA, and it's one of the first to join Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and it's become the real darling of Asia, I would argue. And of course, one country to also follow is the Philippines, because it's emerged as one of the fastest growing countries. So that gives Asia a lot of pull in terms of, every multinational you talk to now has Asia and this particular part of Asia on its radar. There's no shortage of capital. Really, the money is available. Now it's just everybody's chasing the opportunity. So it's become exciting, but I would argue a slightly crowded area for trade and investment. So now moving on back to the big picture. Which of these conflicts and these geopolitical shifts actually really matter for what happens in Asia next? Because one of the nice characteristics about Asia is how stable it has been since 1997. You would argue that Asia, having learned the lessons of the 97-98 crash, has become very predictable in some ways. The macro policy is pretty orderly. Central banking policy is okay in most cases. Trade has been relatively open to trade, and it's been very focused on structural growth, productivity growth, about raising the standard of living. So it's been a nice area for investors. However, I would highlight a few things that could lead to certain dislocations. I think oil and commodity price is a big concern, especially the volatility. I think on the one hand, of course, low oil price environment is net very positive for Asia, because as a net importer, China and India are benefiting a lot from low oil prices. You've had very nice adjustment in terms of supply side. You now have a lot of competitors, Russia, Saudi, Iran, all competing for business in Asia, so plenty of choice. But I would raise some concerns. I think Asia isn't a monolithic bloc, and it does actually have access to resources of its own that it has historically underinvested and underdeveloped. Because here in Sri Lanka you have mineral resources, you have some offshore fields that are waiting to be explored. Nations like Myanmar and Indonesia have vast untapped resources in oil and gas, in minerals. Even the Philippines has a lot of resources all underground. And I think this particular commodity cycle has been terrible for upstream investment. You've really seen a big exodus of even oil majors who are cutting on their operations. You have seen lack of capital, and generally, basically, we're going into deep freeze, which is maybe great for future generations that these resources will be saved, but I would argue in the next 5, 10, 15 years, this will come back to haunt us, because when the market will tighten again, the prices will go up, as they always do. Then you will find that the dependency ratio on imports of these commodities has probably gone up as opposed to gone down. And countries that have resources will have, again, missed an opportunity to develop their own supplies and build supply chains. Not just become exporters of raw material, but actually build the processing plants, etc. So I think that is a concern. We shouldn't look at oil prices simply from the end consumer point of view. Of course, on the positive side, I do have to say the removal of subsidies is a great thing. It has freed up a lot of taxpayers' money to invest into key sectors such as health and education, which have been traditionally neglected and underinvested in most of Asia. And I think low oil price environment has been hugely positive for the removal of subsidies. Also, I would argue it has put pressure on the governments to look for alternative sources of growth. So non-oil gas sectors, especially tourism, agribusiness, renewable sector, high-tech, have really been seeing some attention recently. And I think this theme of diversification, of expanding your economic base and activity, has taken on some momentum in China, in India, and in Southeast Asia, and of course here in Sri Lanka as well. So I hope, how am I doing for time? If I'm going, okay, 10 more minutes. Okay, I'll try and speed up a little bit. Okay, so the other big theme to watch from geopolitical perspective is the ongoing rivalry between Japan and China. I think overall it's been net positive for Asia. Of course, tensions have sometimes boiled up to the surface, and things did at times look pretty uncomfortable. But generally, I think China and Japan are forces for good in Asia, especially when it comes to infrastructure investment. I think Abenomics was meant to lift Japan out of deflation, but has done has had enormous positive impact outside of Japan. A lot of capital, Japanese capital, has been committed to infrastructure projects, and we've seen examples of high-speed rail, ports, roads, airports, you name it. You really have seen their attention. And capital is going, in some cases I've seen, at 25 basis points for 20 years. So really, somebody's benefiting from this. And China has also responded in a similar way, has been trying to export its technology, very much focusing lately on railways, on high-speed railways. Of course, we've seen the launch of the Asia Infrastructure Bank, which I think is great. Some see it as a rivalry maybe to the IMF or other Western institutions, but I think if it's rivalry, it's healthy rivalry. And I believe the region will benefit. And it's going to address one of the key structural issues for Asia, which is access to long-term capital for countries that really need it, i.e. in the southern part of Asia. Now, already my previous speakers have touched on TPPA. I will disclose I'm a very big fan of TPPA. It is a good question of what will it actually do, because as previous speaker said, there's already a lot of trade going on. What will be the marginal benefit? And I think the marginal benefit does come from higher standards. I think a bit like EU FTA, TPPA, introduces some good international practice, especially protection of intellectual property, there's a negotiation of how to properly develop pharmaceutical sector, and I think it will end up primarily I agree with my previous speaker. It will end up bringing more FDI dollars into Asia. And now the big question is, who are the big winners? And I tend to agree that big winners will be the early joiners who already have a competitive cost base. I think Vietnam is emerging as a very significant beneficiary. I think eventually when the Philippines and Thailand join, they will benefit. I hope very much there's a path for Sri Lanka to join. I don't think it's a closed, exclusive club. I think it is open to new members, and definitely is going to boost trade and growth and productivity in Asia. A final theme for Asia to follow is the ASEAN trade policy. I go from being very optimistic, very upbeat, to very pessimistic and skeptical about the ASEAN project. Malaysia has just completed its chairmanship. Laos is taking over. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of meetings. But the project is moving forward. I think it is easier now to do business in ASEAN, and Sri Lanka has excellent links with ASEAN economies. I think you should be paying attention. And I don't think the ASEAN Economic Community will be implemented as it was supposed to be by the end of this year. I think it will take us another 2 or 3 years before we get there. The big stumbling block, of course, is Indonesia, that has become more protectionist. But overall, I think ASEAN as a bloc, as a trading bloc, is going to be one of those drivers going forward in terms of trade integration, in terms of infrastructure, new linkages, and it is worth paying attention. That's my message. Okay, so I don't have very much time, so I'm just going to quickly go through the rest of the geopolitics. So Europe, which is very important for all of us, Europe, I would say, is going through perhaps the most profound structural change of any region. A lot to do with its internal issues, the welfare state, very ambitious project they launched for Eurozone, and of course the old issues of nationalism, its lack of unity. And I think 2016 is going to be a very testy year for Europe. First of all, we are still on the cusp of something happening with regard with Russia. I think tensions are going to escalate because Russia is going through a really tough period economically, and Russia desperately needs Europe. And Europe also less desperately, but still need Russia. And the fact the two are not talking right now and that they're drifting apart is really not a good thing for neither Europe nor Russia, nor actually the whole regional stability. Secondly, I think the refugee crisis has really exposed a lot of issues in terms of politics, in terms of how European Union functions. The talk about reversing the free border agreements, the rise of nationalism in France, Germany's Chancellor Merkel being under a lot of pressure from her own party. The overall picture is that Europe is fragmenting. Instead of, whereas in the 90s, it was a force for unison, for regional integration, it was a shining example of solidarity and how things could work. Now it's definitely going in the opposite direction. And our biggest hope is that Germany can somehow take control of this process. Of course, the big challenge is right now is that UK is trying to redefine its relationship with the EU. There's a referendum coming up. There's a lot of independence movements which are challenging the 20th century order. You had Scotland voting for a referendum. You have Basque nationalism. Even in Italy, you have Lombardy trying to assert its own. So you definitely have a decentralization, fragmentation, and the weakening of the European project. So overall, it's not great news, unfortunately. I think structurally Europe is going to be very much a weak economy. It is being, of course, helped a lot by monetary policy, by ongoing QE. And the currency, as you heard earlier, is going to continue to weaken. I think in 2016 it will fall below parity with the dollar. So there will be some winners. I suppose European technology is going to be cheaper, so it'll be a good time for to buy equipment for manufacturing, for do engineering solutions, or if you prefer European technology. And this, of course, the other challenges faced by Europe is ongoing conflict in Syria. That's definitely having a very direct effect through refugee crisis. I already mentioned Russia. And the Turkey relationship is also coming unstuck. Partly what just happened between Turkey and Russia, but also because of generally change of direction of Turkey after the election of the re-election of Erdogan, the president. I think Europe as a project is in a bit of a crisis at the moment, and there are a lot of tough decisions to make. Okay, I'm almost out of time. I already mentioned US earlier, and I criticized them for short-termism. Election year is not going to help. I think that all the attention will be on security concerns and much less on finding strategic solutions. And Middle East and the Gulf, I already talked. The political process in Syria remains the top concern. Ongoing, of course, the Saudi oil policy is a big headline grabber at the moment. We have yet to see clarity how OPEC will have any relevance in regulating prices. And of course, continuing discussion, the Iranian peace deal. And we should not forget progress in the post-Arab Spring countries is extremely important. If we are to see some progress in Libya and Egypt, perhaps it will validate the model of moving to democracy. I don't have time for India. I think my previous speaker already tackled some of the issues. And yes, I would repeat the message of we have to pay attention to what's happening in ASEAN. I think there's a lot of excitement in terms of trade and investment opportunities. And I think it's fair to say Sri Lanka can benefit from all the positive developments, especially in Asia. It sits right in the middle of the crossroads and has a strategic advantage. I think its relative position is going to improve. And it's very well positioned to capture new trade, especially between Asian countries and the Middle East. And in conclusion, I think definitely 2016 is a year of action on geopolitics. There's for a while we've been drifting, and I think 2016 is gonna see some big decisions. So geopolitics is very important. Status quo, we don't believe is tenable. We cannot continue to pretend that these frozen conflicts don't exist. The Russian and Syrian dilemmas at the top of the list. China and India, I think, generally are forces for good and seeking stability and especially economic progress. And as I mentioned, I think Sri Lanka is still in a sweet spot. And though should be paying attention to the geopolitical developments, is still largely cushioned from the direct impact. So on that positive note, I hope I've managed to summarize some of the developments, and we'll be happy to take some questions later on. Thank you.
LBR LBO Debrief, Business Climate Outlook of 2016.